Now, speaking at a dental health I'm not going to try and laugh too much today, especially being on camera like this, because I broke a tooth some weeks ago and I haven't had it fixed. Probably remind you of that Roxanne film now, where you'll study my facial expression to see if you can spot the tooth. So look, the respectful workplace for a respectful world. First of all, before I get into it, let me pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples of this country. Amongst other things, the Victorian Women's Trust was in fact the first organisation in Victoria in the 90s, under the leadership of Jure Dara, to make it a principle of providing acknowledgement of country, and it then took up as a good habit. I don't like to parrot a welcome or an acknowledgement of country, but I will say today that my respect is for the 2,000 or so generations of Indigenous people who came before us. The respectful workplace for a respectful world. What a topic, what a brief. In the indoubtable Julie McCormack emailed me at least twice with increasing frenzy in her email, I think, over the last fortnight to say, where's your presentation? We want your presentation. And I had to very diplomatically say, well, actually, I haven't done it. And I'm not doing one in terms of overheads. But because she put me under the hammer a bit, I thought, well, maybe I actually need to write it a bit more than I normally would. So I'm warning you, you now need to sit back. There are no overheads. You need to listen and I'll talk. But I do want to thank Julie and the conference organisers for being part of your program, because even though there's a pressure that goes with it, it is an opportunity for me to stop and reflect as well. So what I'd like to do in my talk to you today is to approach it in the following way. First of all, I want to do a little bit of a quick environmental scan around the issue of respect and disrespect. I want to look, when I look at those trends, I just want to unpack those words a little bit for people. It's not rocket science, but they're deep concepts. Then I want to look at how issues of notions of respect, civility, regard, trust play out in a lot of day-to-day scenarios, and then want to try and transpose all of that into a workplace. So let me start by observing what I think are some very discordant, jangling, clanging kinds of dissonances that are across our society. I think we've seen even the concept of respect being trashed. I see people being more personally abusive to one another, not just to people in prominent positions, but to one another, and often anonymously over social media. I see people being prepared to vent their anger publicly. I've seen people thinking it's okay to act with your worst side exposed in a workplace or other settings. We haven't seen an end to the awful sexism that swirled, for example, around our first female Prime Minister, and the misogyny that came out of very dark corners, which hasn't, the only reason it's gone away is because the blokes are back in power, actually. It's hard to be sexist in the same way. We've seen, as you know very well, we've seen hideous stories all around us offending our decency, whether it's surgeons and their harassment, talkback radio, the behaviour of the Catholic Church hierarchy, some segments of it, in their cocking a snoot at evidence and proper process and respect for institutions like a Royal Commission. We've seen footy shows with people such as Sam Newman still basically uncontested in what he dishes out most weeks. I'm told. I stopped listening a long time ago. Social media, I'll come back to that later, in terms of, I think, aiding and abetting some awful channels of disrespect across our community. And we haven't seen a reduction in violent attitudes and behaviours. And violent attitudes and behaviours in the home and on the streets and in workplaces, the ultimate expression of disrespect of one to the other. And yet we know that the ethical compass of millions of Australians women and men, is set very differently. Millions of Australian men and women have an intuitive sense of these important intangibles that go to the core of social cohesion and civility. And if these are being corroded, as they think they are, then it's time for us to jolt ourselves into remembering that these things don't magically transpose over generations. We have to keep on taking stock, reminding ourselves and putting our shoulders to the wheel again. And I feel blessed, actually, that in some recent work I did in publishing A Switch in Time, and some of you might have seen a full-page advertisement that the Women's Trust took out when Julia Gillard was deposed by Kevin Rudd, called A Credit Where Credit's Due. And I feel blessed because the Women's Trust was avalanched by thousands of pieces of feedback from women and men all over Australia, 99.99% of it positive. And I feel blessed because I feel as though it got us in touch very closely and deeply with a very strong ethical core that affects and takes up the behaviour and the mind space of a lot of Australian people. So let's have a quick look at the idea of respect. Basically, it is about holding someone in esteem, paying regard to the other. It is about being polite and kind, about being considered of the other. It actually comes from the Latin respitere, to pay attention to. And it's synonymous almost with the notion of regard, which is to look closely and attentively at someone, to hold someone in respect and admiration. If you regard someone, if you pay attention to someone, you are prepared to listen to them, to hear them, to actually try and understand them. Trust, that all-important component in a society, is where you're prepared to place your confidence in the worth and reliability of a person or a group or an institution. And one of my beefs with the Abbott opposition, for example, when I wrote A Switch in Time, one of my beefs was that those people in the opposition at the time, and egged on by people such as Andrew Bolt and others in the Murdoch press, were prepared to trash our democratic institutions, such as a minority government, which, as long as the confidence of the lower house was maintained, it had every right to be a legitimate expression of government. Confidence is another part of this deep tribal set of values. Confidence, the willing to trust a person, a group, or an institution. And civility, to accord courtesy to the other. Now, these fairly obvious kinds of values, however, are deep. They're not superficial things to be played around with. They are earned. You earn respect, it's not freely given. You earn trust, it's not automatically given. When trust is broken, it's actually difficult to build it back, but one must. So we're not talking skin-deep impacts here. These values go to our core as human beings. We are, every one of us, sharply offended if we know someone disrespects us. It's not about vanity, it's not about ego. When you are hurt by someone, by an unfairness or by a great show of disrespect, it goes to your core because it's about who you are, your identity and your sense of personhood. To be able to respect, regard, to trust, to be confident about someone is not about liking or disliking them. You can, in fact, dislike someone but still respect them. And there are universals here, across faiths, across cultures, across societies. There's a line that I love in the Quran which says, "Enter not houses other than your own until you have asked permission and saluted those in them." And yet look at how Islam is being so disrespected by parts of our society. How do these deep ethical values of respect, regard, trust, civility play out in everyday lives and everyday matters? When I wrote A Switch in Time, which I was motivated to write because it seemed to me that the day after Julia Gillard became Prime Minister was when the atmosphere changed, when I started to notice the subtle, the nuanced sexism and the obvious sexism and the disrespect, not just for her, but in fact for the office of the Prime Minister itself. And I gathered evidence. I went into the social media channels. I followed all of the mainstream journalists, including female journalists such as Catherine Murphy and Michelle Grattan and others, Janet Albrechtsen. I watched them all. I read, I researched, and then I wrote this, Switch in Time, Restoring Respect to Australian Politics. And I said at the bottom of the document, slippery little word, respect, easy to say, sounds good, harder to practice. When I was putting my thoughts to this, I thought, you know what, to talk about respect and regard and so on, think of a brick wall metaphor, a solid, durable brick wall that's not crumbling, even with age. Its efficacy, its durability, is a result of two things in play. One is the quality of the materials, the quality of the cement, the quality of the binding material that holds those bricks in place. But another equally, if not, in fact, more important thing at play is the quality of the workpersonship that has gone into the proper spacing, the proper spread, the proper amount, the trimming and whatever of that seamless cement. In balance, not slapdash, a very tradesperson-like application. And so, in this sense, in the way we practice these values, we are the social tradies. And I might add, just an aside, I hope I don't take too long here, but Julie McCormack, who has been so pivotal in today's events, I first actually met and started working and respecting someone like Julie when we funded, from the Victorian Women's Trust, the first Women in Trades directory, the first ever in this country, a Women in Trades directory, which she and then Sally Northfield got further funding from us and they put it online. We are the social tradies and we are responsible for the application, the non-slapdash application of these intangible values in our workplaces, our families, our school communities, our faith communities, our institutions. We are responsible for their application, not someone else. So let me go into them in this way, as social tradies. Point one, the dignity and the worth of a person, every person, is respected. The dignity and the worth of every person is respected. That's our first proposition. When I first started at the Women's Trust, one of the first initiatives, we ran this project across Victoria, the Purple Sage Project, with a new model of dialogue at the grassroots. We involved over 6,000 women and men in small groups of up to 10, in their kitchens, their dining rooms, in their book clubs, in a community hall, in deep conversation, respectful conversation, listening to one another, maybe dissenting from one another, but doing so respectfully. And when we came to write this document, it was easier to write sections like the erosion of democracy, the withdrawal of government support for public education, and all the other things that were distressing to Victorians at the time. But there was something percolating through the responses of those 6,000 people across the state that we thought we must capture it. What is it? And we realised that people in their responses were feeding back to us, not in a systematic order, but were feeding back to us a whole lot of important community values that were in fact under the hammer by the government at the day. That was, for example, privatising everything that moved, if they could, without realising that a lot of voters, both Conservative, National Party and regional, were saying, but these assets are not yours to sell. We built them, they're ours. So when we published this, we actually had a section that is called Guiding Community Values and Principles. And we were able to frame them easily because it's how people articulated them across that many months of dialogue. We'll read you the three. These are not what we're making up. We just captured what a whole lot of ordinary people think at the grassroots level. the dignity and worth of every person is respected. Each person has the right to food and shelter, access to a clean and healthy natural environment, care in sickness, defence at law, dignity in work, and the pleasures and opportunities that education provides. Number 3, people are social beings who desire to connect and be part of the families, the groups, and communities that offer human contact and mutual support. This is the essence of humanity. This is the essence of the human condition. And many of you, in terms of that deep respect, the dignity and worth of every person, I couldn't resist for today to bring forth in your memory a part of that famous speech from Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Point 2. We recognise and accept that another's lived experience may not be anywhere near the same as ours, yours or mine. Which means you have to try and learn and encourage in yourself the ability to observe and appreciate and understand with sensitivity and sensibility the different lived experience, whether it's from a woman to a man, whether it's to a poor person, a seriously poor person, to a woman who might be facing homelessness, or to somebody who is in a high profession, or someone who's a tradie. Remember Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird. It made a huge impact on me as a teenager in my convent school in Portland, where Scout can't understand this strange creature over the road called Boo Radley. And she says to Atticus, "What is it about him? He's strange, he's weird." And Atticus says to her, "Scout, if you want to understand Boo, you have to be able to get into his body, walk around in his shoes, and then you'll have a more empathic sense of who Boo is and what he's on about." I'll give you a more contemporary understanding. One of my heroes, not because he's one of the few men internationally who is such an eloquent campaigner against violence, but he's a brilliant communicator and writer, Jackson Katz. And Jackson does this wonderful exercise to demonstrate that the lived experience of a man on the question of violence and abuse is very different from the lived experience, usually, of a woman. And he wants men to understand that if violence and abuse is not part of their experience, it doesn't mean to say it doesn't exist and hurt people. So Jackson will get a room full of men and women and a whiteboard, and he'll give a whiteboard marker to the guys, and he'll say, "Righto guys, you're first. Go up to the whiteboard and put up there all the things you do on a daily basis, weekly basis, to protect yourself from violence, to make yourself safe." Silence. And then a wag will say, "I'll try and stay out of jail." In effect, it's hard for the men to go to the board, not because they're reticent, but because it's not part of their lived experience. So then he gives the pens to the women, and next minute the board is filled. And the women in this room, I would say pretty much every one of you would put something on that board. I would. I don't walk my dog at night on my own, for example, at 10:30. Women will clutch their keys more tightly in their handbag. They're more likely to look in the back seat of their car in the city before they take off. They're more likely, if they can, not to hire a ground floor apartment for rent. They're more likely to get their boyfriend to pick them up from the train station, and so on and so forth. So the lived experience is so vastly different. And part of the challenge of all of us in our own ways is not to privilege our own lived experience above that of others, but to understand where others come from, understand our own lived experience, and be able to marry the whole deal. And that essentially, is about empathy. You can't do it unless you cultivate and nourish your ability to be empathic. Point 3, that one of the deepest expressions of respect is the ability to listen. Listen to the other. Listening is an attitude and not a methodology. If you haven't yet seen a superb documentary film that was screened on the ABC late last year called Call Me Dad, which follows the journey of a small number of men who admitted themselves to behaviour change programs because of their abusive behaviour in their families and to their partners and children. If you haven't seen it, watch it sometime and just look at the ability of Dave Bryant and his working colleague, but especially Dave Bryant. Watch him just to appreciate how he listened to those men, how he repressed his own capacity to talk to them and maybe dominate. He listened to them so deeply that it was largely that enabled them to start their journey of reflection and self-regard, and ultimately allowing joy to come into their lives and hopefully to go onto a new path of free of violence. But watch Dave if you want to see a man who understands that listening to the other is one of the greatest forms of respect you can pay. From the Purple Sage project, we then used that same community dialogue process to do a project on water. And even though we had some people saying, why is the Women's Trust doing a water project? Which is an interesting question. I won't go into that today. But we used it very successfully in the Watermark project, catching up several thousand people again in that respectful dialogue. And then just in 2012, 2013, I was called up by the Voice for Indi, the group of women and men up in the northeast of Victoria who were so disgruntled with the degree of their representation from their local member, Sophie Mirabella, that they asked if I would mentor them into this kitchen table conversation model so that they could roll out the engagement process across the electorate. And so I did. We worked together for 5 months. I won't go into the level of detail of that, except when we first met the day before Cup Day in 2012, and I have to tell you that there was a little bit inside that room, a little bit of slagging off towards the local member. And we did work as a group on the values that would underpin their process, and one of them was respect. And I said, well, if you're going to put respect out there as one of the values of Voice for Indi, then today is the day you stop slagging off at your local member, irrespective of any political differences you might have. And so they did. They had to, in order to have integrity. And it's interesting that the independent MP, Cathy McGowan, who, as a result of that engagement process and a brilliant campaign, especially by youngies and social media and so on, that she eliminated a 9% swing and defied the national trend and became the new independent in the House. And she herself has been modelling that kind of respect as an independent. And so many times I've seen her speak publicly, and she'll talk about how important it is to work to people's best sides, not to let the worst in people get the best of you either, but to actually keep searching for the best sides in people and working with those. But why I told you about that process is because every time we have run this process, this kitchen table process, back 20 years ago, in water, across Victoria, in Indi, wherever we have, do you know what the most common feedback is we receive for that hard work? People say, thank you. People stop and thank you for giving them the opportunity to be listened to be heard, to have their voices accounted for, rather than run out, get a few opinions, run back, run a few focus groups, never get back to people. To be listened to respectfully, to be heard, to have your voices and your opinions shaped up into some kind of mandate for the person to then take into the National Parliament. And another exercise that I wanted to quickly tell you about, in the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, at the Women's Trust we brought together and facilitated 5 other wonderful agencies all working at the coalface in the family violence arena. EDVOS out in the east, Safe Futures Foundations, Safe Steps and Wishen. And over a period of about 5 months, many Fridays, often 7 hours, those women did something for the first time in their professional lives. They came together as agencies, they engaged in a deep collaboration with one another. They respected one another so much that if there were disagreements, they found resolution. And they had to compromise their position on aspects of policy and procedure and programs and service delivery in order to meld a collective and powerful voice. They were so influential in bringing this together that the Royal Commission itself, the report, refers to that document many, many times, and I think just about all of those women who collaborated in that respectful way were asked to give witness at the Royal Commission itself. So my point is, if you build this culture of respect and exercise it in so many ways of working with these women, bringing them together, insisting on this kind of basis for operating on, everybody won from that process, and they are changed women too. No matter how good they were as professional operators beforehand, they're even smarter and stronger and more collegial and more effective as a result. Point 4, that sexism and unchecked prejudice, violent attitudes and behaviours are sourced by disrespect, and I might add, oftentimes by self-loathing. It's hard to give respect to another if you don't feel respect for yourself. When you feel respect for yourself, genuine self-respect, instead of unbridled narcissism or whatever, but when you are sure of yourself and your values and you feel that you can commit in your own practice to being who you are, you're more likely to be able to pay respect to the other. The question of the sexism that swirled around Julia Gillard, for example, was based on a fundamental, deep-seated disrespect by a lot of men who couldn't countenance the idea of a woman sitting at the head of the political table because it's not what women did. And it was also sourced, the sexism, I'm sad to say, by a lot of Australian women who were not prepared to respect a woman who was a career woman, a woman who didn't have snotty-nosed little kids around her ankle, and so on. So the reason that people are sexist, both women and men, as they showed at that time, go to the fact that we can have such blind spots, that we think we're fine, we think we're fair, we think we're egalitarian, but actually when push comes to shove, we failed to give respect. But I'm heartened by the fact that when we were avalanched, as I said before, into the office for weeks, and after the Credit Where Credit Was Due was published, we were avalanched even more significantly. And we had thousands of feedback from all over the country. We had more money too. The initial ad cost us $94,000 to take out in 4 national newspapers. That was paid for by 5 women donors. But then people gave us money, like 92-year-old Max, World War II veteran. "Thank you, ladies," he said, and gave us $200. In fact, we raised so many more dollars that we had the same advertisement of a respectful tribute to Julia Gillard. We had the same advertisement translated into Italian and Greek and, for Kevin Rudd's sake, Mandarin. And we had it published in Microcosms, La Fiamma, Il Globo and the Tsingtao Daily. And we reached about 3.5 million Australian readers about a proper tribute, respectful tribute for someone who negotiated 3 years of difficult minority government with composure and poise and a reasonably reformist legislative program, and doing so against the odds, including a really disrespectful bunch of men within her own party and a disrespectful opposition. But when we have unchecked prejudice, because we all have prejudice are shortcuts. They're shortcuts to judgment, and we've all got them. The trick is, in my term, you dredge and deal with them. You bring them up, you bring them out, and you deal with them. I can remember as a country girl coming down to Melbourne Uni a long time ago, and Hayward, where I grew up, was pretty monocultural. We had a few Indigenous families that the community referred to as half-castes. And I came to Melbourne Uni and I sat in the cafeteria, and I can tell you that it was the first time that I'd ever sat next to African men in the caf. And it discombobulated me a little bit. I just wasn't used to it. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, I actually went into myself and thought, why is this? Why am I noticing this even? Why am I noticing that man is deeply black? And got in touch with my own prejudice, my own lack of familiarity, and then dealt with it. Do I value social justice? Do I value regard for the next person? Yes, I do. Well, start here then. Dredge and deal, instead of going back into yourself and repressing your prejudices. The big challenge for people in this room, all of us, is to deal in that way with the bombardment that's going on about Islamic religion in this country of ours, and our refugee and immigrant issues. The real issue for us is to deal with that bombardment in terms of our own makeup and our own values and our own deep desire to try and live with decency and to deal with those prejudices. And violent attitudes and behaviour which are sourced by disrespect will only become more marginalised in our sports clubs, in our institutions, in our workplaces, in our families, in our communities, when we have greater gender equality. Because you see, the simple proposition, hard to effect, but the simple proposition is that you don't hit someone or hurt someone if you respect them. It just doesn't fit. So the more equality there is between women and men, the more equality that is founded on mutual respect, there will, by definition, be less abuse and violence. And indeed, some of the research coming out of the United Nations is showing that the greater the degree of gender equality across nations, the less the violent attitudes and behaviours. Point 5. Gender equity is ultimately, as I said, about mutual respect. And let me give you another little metaphor here to illustrate my construction of feminism, why I'm proud to be a feminist, and the Women's Trust construction of feminism, why it's proudly a feminist organisation. I started a community choir in 2002 in Northcote, and we called ourselves, fairly prosaically, Northern Voice, because that was the catchment area. Why I say it was prosaic is that I actually initially, because it was started by Mary, myself, and Joseph, our Georgian Russian migrant, I wanted to call ourselves the Immaculate Conception. But I thought it might be a bit offensive, and maybe the nuns in Portland might hear about it. But I love singing, and I love choral works, and our Joseph believes that singing in unison is really boring. It's the first part of the metaphor. And so everything we sing in our own amateur way is 4-part harmony. And because we're a mixed choir, and we're mainly women, but we have about 6 men in our choir with beautiful tenor and baritone and bass voices. And so the choir metaphor is this. when you hear a group of women on their own singing, it's a beautiful sound. When you hear an all-male choir, a Welsh male choir for example, it will make the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. It's so superb. But when you hear a choir of men and women singing together, it actually produces a richness of sound that neither of the other two can produce. And that is a positive affirmation of the feminist quest. And let me remind you, this is why, for example, as a feminist organisation, that the Victorian Women's Trust, we've worked closely and are closely still working in partnership with Melbourne Storm. Now there's a curious partnership, a fine feminist organisation working with a rugby league club, and it's a fantastic partnership around our violence prevention program for boys, Be the Hero. And it's a wonderful partnership because the men at Melbourne Storm, from the CEO down, have absolutely no qualms or problems or discomfort at sitting alongside us and working with us on these really complex issues of getting it right in terms of violence prevention education that makes a difference. And let me give you an historical example of how we might have lost the plot a bit over the decades on this notion of collective partnership between men and women. In 1894, might have been 1895, but the South Australian men in that colonial parliament, they were the first to enfranchise women in Australia. We followed on from the New Zealanders. But South Australia was first. When all the men were negotiating to start the Federation of Australia in the 1900s, or late 19th century, early 20th century, the men at the federation level, the non-South Australian men, weren't automatically assuming that women in the Federation of Australia would actually have the vote. It wasn't on their radar. The South Australian men said to them, if you're not prepared to transpose South Australian women's voting rights into the federal constitution, we're walking. And that's how all of the women in this room, that's how we got the vote to vote federally. Because South Australian men said, you either do the same as you've done with our women folk, or we're out of here. So we mustn't lose sight, I think, of those ginormous partnerships that have served us well. So now back onto how does this transpose into workplaces? Well, not in order of priority, but respectful workplaces are going to be those that are as free as possible of prejudice, because the people who become aware of any prejudice they might have to whether it's someone of a different ethnic background, someone of a different religion, someone of a different age, someone with a different qualification or lived experience, that if we felt that we're aware of a prejudice, we've dredged and dealt with it. So a respectful workplace is one where people are honest in dealing with their prejudice. And a respectful workplace is one where the exchange between people at all levels, hierarchy down, bottom up, is what I might call constructive discontent. In other words, we don't have to all like one another furiously, we don't have to all agree furiously with one another, but we do have to be able to listen to one another, to hear the opinion of another, to respect the giving of that opinion, even if it doesn't necessarily translate into the formulation of a decision, but people understand why that's occurred and they are accepting of it. So all exchanges, while they're personal, they're not attacking, they're not rebuffing, they are fundamentally constructive and respectful, which means people listen deeply to one another. It's good to test yourselves at times. It's good to have a talk on a Monday with someone around the water cooler if you've got a water cooler, and then maybe 2 hours later ask yourself, what did she say? And if you can't remember it 2 hours later, either early signs of something or you just weren't listening. You just weren't listening. And you need to test yourselves because listening is practice. Deep listening is practice. The clarity of communications are crucial in a respectful workplace. You don't want people feeling as though somebody's issued a sleight of hand or talked badly about somebody else because the communication was sloppy or it wasn't acknowledging people enough. One of the interesting things I've had to countenance over the last 18 months, I've actually joined a board of a women's funding network which is based in San Francisco, and it's the group that's responsible for supporting women's funds all around the world. And mainly all the board members, all the women, are American women. And I have found it culturally so interesting that when they will hear the report from the finance officer, and they all to a woman say, "Reza, that's awesome, hey, Reza, go." At the Women's Trust, when Wilfredo gives his finance report, we'll say, "Thanks, Wilfredo, that's great. Now, item 6. And so I've had to get used to what I think is over-the-top acknowledgement of awesome performance and realise that, hey, actually maybe the extreme of that is under-acknowledgement of one to the other as a manager and a leader and a colleague and a peer. Teamwork. You cannot have a respectful workplace and good teamwork at the same time. They go with one another. Same with collegiality that reflects genuine regard, trust and transparency. A respectful workplace is where everyone in the organisation, from the person who might be your car park attendant to the person on the door that lets you in, to your patients, to your clients, to your external stakeholders, everyone is treated with regard and trust. I had an old mentor, Joycey, when I was in my 20s at Melbourne Uni. I met her. We had a strong friendship for years. There was 25 years difference between us. And she used to refer to, her term was other regardingness. You are nothing without other regardingness. In other words, the regard you are prepared to hold for another person. So you value people across the organisation. People are your best assets at every level. You also, though, don't just have respect for the other, you have respect for the law, which is why you value the need to be a compliant organisation, not because compliance is a burden, but because you respect the operation of the law in order to have a functioning organisation. You will probably have, I hope, a staff code of conduct which pledges staff to being respectful of one another, apart from other things. You will have a staff where you have encouraged people to have the courage of being a bystander. If there's something wrong, if there's something that's an issue in the office or the workplace, don't talk behind your hand, don't sneakily form a faction and talk to that faction. Have the courage to either go to the top with your concern or your distress, and if that's too hard, find someone who'll do it for you, someone who'll be your proxy bystander. So when there's disrespect or when respect is not working, everybody has some kind of responsibility to pitch in and help. Leaders and managers have to walk the walk and talk the talk. Leaders and managers set the cultural tone. And one of the reasons we've got such a deep political malaise in our country, which is still not being remedied, is that the cultural tone of respect for women, for our institutions, for good debate and whatever, is not being set from the top. And we thought it might have been 6 months ago when Malcolm Turnbull became leader and Prime Minister, but I think we haven't had enough evidence that the cultural tone has really shifted. And think, for example, when Tony Abbott stood in front of those placards years ago and stood beside Bronwyn Bishop and Sophie Mirabella, in front of placards that said, "Ditch the witch," and "Bob Brown's bitch." Imagine if the news that day was that Tony Abbott had refused to speak until those disgusting placards were brought down. Now that's setting cultural tone in the positive, and he actually didn't do it, which was also damaging. Leaders and managers are the ones who set the tone, and they consciously build the culture of respect, so that it's neither accidental nor incidental. None of this is smooth or easy, however. If this was easy and we could click our fingers, the world would be a very different place. It requires commitment, watchfulness, and being truthful and honest with oneself and others. We can all be put to the test too quickly. All it takes in a workplace is for the presence of one overweening narcissist, a game player whose preference is to talk behind the hands, a person who leaks confidential information for impure reasons rather than noble whistleblower reasons. All it takes is for people to take the easy course, which is factionalised activity, to break the trust that is vital in a workplace, to break the culture of respect that then has to be renourished and reborn. So let me close by saying that respectful workplaces are microcosms of society. And just the way, yes, I'm passionate about football, I am for my sins one of the ambassadors for the Carlton Football Club. But they have pledged as a club that's been one of the most powerful on the field and one of the most blokey boys clubs in the country, they have pledged nonetheless to turn that club into one of the most gender equity clubs in the nation. And they've set up a diversity committee to also help the process, and I've said yes, I'll be on that committee, and we're now going to work there. Just as sport is a microcosm of society, so are our workplaces. If we get it right in our homes, if we get it right in our workplaces, then we will see automatically less discordance across our society, less social division, less sexism, less bullying and harassment. We will see more fairness. We will see an elevation of respect and regard and trust. We will think we haven't lost all civility because it looks as though civility is alive and well. And we will be doing our bit to maintain social confidence. So let me end with a quote that has stayed in my mind for a long time from the UK Commission of Social Justice. Communities are not strong because they're rich. They're rich because they're strong. And respect is the key, no matter how faddish you think it might be, with another respectful relationships program drifting in from on high. Respect is the key to workplaces, to homes, to institutions, to neighbourhoods, to societies. Thank you.